You know what? You don't have to keep buying expensive fertilizers just because those fancy marketing labels say they're specially formulated or scientifically balanced. You can make your own. Most of what you're paying for in those expensive bottles is already sitting in your backyard for free. In this video, I'm going to show you how I turned a simple 90-litre barrel, some comfrey, and a pile of grass clippings into a liquid fertilizer so powerful it rivaled my best store-bought brands. But there is a catch. If you get the biology wrong, you can fry your plants. So I'm going to use my EC and pH meter to show you exactly what's happening inside this ferment so you don't have to guess. We'll cover the setup, the smell test, and the exact numbers that will tell me when it's ready. And if you stick around to the end, I'll share my lemonade moment where I pushed a batch way too far, what it did to the bed, and the simple tweak that turned it from "oh no" into "this can actually save me a packet" on store-bought fertilizers. So if you've ever wondered whether you really need those fancy bottles on the shelf, or whether a barrel of homegrown brew can actually match them, in this video we're going to find that out and more. Alright, so here's what we're doing. I wanted a low-fuss, high-reward way to turn what I already have in the yard into a proper fertilizer that I can measure and repeat. Not just a random witch's brew that sometimes works and sometimes nukes the garden bed. So I've set up a classic JADAM Liquid Fertilizer, or JLF. It's basically an anaerobic plant tea where microbes break down your plant material and release nutrients into the water. For this batch, I used a 90-litre barrel because that's what I had lying around. But you can absolutely size this up if you've got a bigger block. So here's what I put into mine. First up, I packed it with comfrey. I've been growing this for a while. It's loaded with potassium, so it's brilliant for flowers and fruit. Then I did the lazy gardener move. Grass clippings straight out of the mower. It's a perfect little nitrogen hit. I put in about 2 litres of good finished compost as well. That adds more nutrients and a heap of microbes. Then I also added about 1 litre of leaf mould from under our fruit trees. That stuff is chock full of fungal spores and other biology. Then I filled the barrel up with rainwater from our tank. I actually checked the rainwater before we started with my meter. The EC was basically 0 and the pH was around 7.4. EC just means how many dissolved salts and nutrients are in the liquid. So it's a really clean baseline to start with. No salts and slightly on the alkaline side. Now, it needs to be said you don't need a meter to make this work. But I'm going to use mine so you can see how EC and pH move over time. And you can use my numbers as a guide to what you might expect if you make your own. So here's what we're going to cover in this video. First up, I'll walk you through the setup and why I picked each ingredient. Then we'll look at what actually happens inside that barrel over a few weeks. We'll talk about the big questions, like what sort of EC and pH we're aiming for, and how to know when it's actually ready to use. Then I'll show you how I dilute it and use it in a real backyard with numbers that make sense for a standard 9-litre bucket. We'll also touch on what the research says about comfrey and nettle-style liquid feeds compared to the fancy commercial products. And we'll also chat about whether comfrey and grass make a different quality fertilizer compared to nettles, food scraps, or other things you might throw in. Now, before we get stuck into the nerdy bits, do us a quick favour. hit that like and subscribe button. It won't cost you anything. It's just consider it as the fuel this video needs to keep the channel moving. Alright, let's start with how I set this up, because this is where it's really easy to either make it way too weak or so strong you end up frying your plants. So I've got a 90-litre barrel in a spot away from the house and in full sun. And that was deliberate. The warmth speeds up the microbial action, and keeping it away from the house keeps that bloody smell away from the morning coffee. And into that barrel I put one grass catcher full of clippings straight out of the mower. I put about 2 litres of complete compost and 1 litre of leaf mould. And then I pretty much stuffed the rest of the barrel with comfrey leaves until I couldn't fit any more in. So here's the thing. The compost and the leaf mould we added aren't just fillers. They're your inoculants. Leaf mould brings in a diverse fungi and bacteria, while the compost adds even more microbes plus a broader range of additional nutrients. Then I topped the whole thing up with rainwater. Look, I should have left a bit of headspace because it can, and actually did, overflow when it started bubbling. I checked the rainwater with the meter. The EC was basically 0 and the pH was 7.4, which is about what you'd expect from clean rainwater. Now, this is important. We're not aiming for precision chemistry here. We're aiming for repeatability. If you can jot down the barrel size, roughly how much plant material you crammed in, and what you added as inoculant, you can tweak and improve future batches instead of just guessing every time. If you don't have a meter and you still do exactly the same thing, you just follow the time, smell, and dilution cues that we'll get into a bit later. Once that lid goes on, this is where the magic and the stink really happens. Inside the barrel, microbes start breaking down the comfrey, grass, and other bits, and all those nutrients, nitrogen, potassium, calcium, trace elements, start dissolving into the water. I give mine a rough stir about once a week. You'll often see a thin white skin form on top between stirs. That's just the biology doing its thing at the surface. As all this is happening, 2 key numbers on my meter start to shift. EC, or electrical conductivity, which is basically how loaded up the liquid is with dissolved salts and nutrients. And pH, how acidic or alkaline the brew is. From growers using JADAM style ferments, there's a pattern that shows up again and again. If you measure the EC of a JLF as it ferments, it tends to climb over time, sometimes ending up anywhere from about 1 to 6 undiluted, depending on how hard you've packed it and how long you leave it. One experienced JADAM grower reckons keeping the finished JLF itself in the range of about 1 to 2 EC gave them the most reliable, safe results for soil drenches. Others have seen undiluted ferments climb to EC levels of 3 to 6 over several weeks as more nutrients dissolve out of the plant material. At the same time, pH usually drifts a bit acidic as the brew ferments, often ending up somewhere in the pH range of 5 to 7. So where does that leave us if you don't have a meter? The key idea is this. EC tells you how strong the fertilizer is. pH tells you how hot or gentle it might be on leaves and roots. But in practice, your nose, your eyes, and your dilution rate will keep you out of trouble. If you do have a meter, you'll see EC steadily climbing week by week and pH slowly easing down from neutral into the slightly acidic zone. If you don't, you're watching for the change from a fresh plant smell to that properly fermented funky earth smell and darker, more tea-like colour. Turns out, even simple comfrey and nettle ferments made with plain water extraction have shown nutrient levels in the same ballpark as commercial liquid feeds when used at normal dilution rates. So for our backyard JLF, a practical target is this. Let it ferment for at least 2 to 3 weeks in warm weather and longer if it's cooler. If you have a meter, start checking EC and pH weekly and watch them stabilise. On this batch, at exactly 3 weeks in my JLF, had shot up to an EC of about 9 and the pH had drifted down to around 3. That's on the strong side and pretty acidic as a concentrate, which is why we treat it like a stock solution and dilute it right down before it gets anywhere near the plants. If you don't have a meter, just wait until it's clearly broken down, nice and dark, and has that proper fermented funk to it. Once it hits that stage, you've got usable fertilizer. All right, so what about timing? When can you actually start using this stuff? Can it sit in the barrel too long? And where's that sweet spot where you're getting maximum benefit without overdoing it? From JADAM guidelines and people using this in the real world, you see a pretty wide dilution range. Anything from about 1 to 30 out to 1 to 200 or even 1 to 500, depending on the crop, how strong your brew is and what sort of soil you've got. One Aussie source suggests around 1 to 20 for general use and closer to 1 to 30 or weaker for seedlings. Others running JADAM ferments prefer a gentle maintenance rate of around 1 to 30 and say 1 to 100 or 1 to 200 is plenty strong for pest type brews for your foliar sprays. But this is the bit that changed everything for me. I stopped thinking of JLF as this recipe equals this dilution and started thinking it in more terms of EC at the point of use. A lot of growers aim for soil EC somewhere around 1 to 2 and don't like to push much past about 2.3. So here's a simple way to run it with a 9 litre bucket if you've got a meter. First, measure the EC of your undiluted JLF. On this batch, at 3 weeks, the stock JLF was reading about 9 and the pH was down around 3. So I tipped 1 litre of that into a 9 litre bucket, topped it up with the additional 8 litres of water and checked it again. In the bucket, the mix came out at about an EC of 1.5 with a pH around 5.6. That's right in that safe zone, but still useful for most garden beds. So I used it as a soil drench around the plants. If your stock JLF is weaker than mine, say closer to 4 or 5, you'll need a bit more in the bucket to land around that 1 to 1.5 EC mark. If it's even stronger than an EC of 9, you'll use less, obviously. The principles are the same. Start with a small amount in the bucket, check EC and creep up on that 1 to 2 EC target rather than dumping in a heap and hoping for the best. Now these EC based mixes ended up in the same kind of strength range as those 1 to 20 or 1 to 30 recipes you see online. This is just a more precise way to land there if you've got a meter. If you don't have a meter, you can still keep it simple. Treat very dark, thick, inky brews like a concentrate. Use it more diluted. Treat lighter, tea-coloured brews as milder, meaning you can bump the ratio up a bit. Now, can it sit too long? Absolutely, yes, you can overdo it. There are reports of 3-month-old JLF being strong enough to burn plants when it's used too concentrated, and 14-month-old batches being so intense they actually killed plants when they were poured on undiluted. The longer it sits, the more plant material breaks down and the more concentrated the nutrients become. That doesn't make it bad, it just means you have to dilute it more. From what growers and biodynamic trials have seen, a window of about 2 to 8 weeks after the brew gets active is a really nice balance between good nutrient punch and manageable smell and handling. You can keep using it well beyond that, but treat older, darker, thicker brews as concentrates and just step up your dilution. If you're ever in doubt, test a stronger and a weaker mix on 2 similar plants. and then see who looks happier after about a week. All right, now let's talk about what actually went into this barrel, because not all JLFs are going to be created equal. You might be wondering, is my comfrey and grass brew any good compared to nettles or other fancy mixes? Research looking at comfrey and nettle liquid feeds made with simple water extractions found that, undiluted, they had nutrient levels pretty similar to commercial liquid fertilizers used at normal strength. Comfrey tends to shine with higher potassium and good phosphorus, which is brilliant for flowering and fruiting crops like tomatoes, capsicums, cucumbers, and fruit trees. Nettles, on the other hand, usually come out higher in available nitrogen than comfrey, which makes them a bit more like a leafy growth booster. So here's the thing. Your ingredient choice nudges the personality of the fertilizer. Comfrey plus grass is fairly balanced, with good potassium and decent nitrogen. It's a nice all-rounder, especially for fruiting. Nettles are heavier, more nitrogen-based, and they're great for leafy greens and early vegetative growth. Food scrap JLFs can end up very high in nitrogen and need longer fermentation and heavier dilution to avoid burning your plants. But in all cases, what the trials and on-farm experience both show is that these ferments can absolutely hold their own against store-bought liquids, as long as you dilute sensibly and don't treat them like a magic potion. From a self-sufficiency point of view, that's the win. You're taking weeds, prunings, and spare biomass and turning them into something that performs in the same ballpark as a commercial product for basically the cost of a barrel and a bit of patience. My plan with this 90-litre comfrey JLF is to log the EC and pH over time, note when I start using it, and then track any visible differences in growth, flowering and yield compared to beds without it. That way, we're not just saying, yeah, it feels pretty good. We're actually showing real numbers. All right, let's bring this thing back down to the backyard. So you've got your barrel of JLF. You've measured EC and maybe pH. It smells intense. Now what? Here's a simple way to use it with a 9-litre bucket without turning your garden into a science lab. For general feeding of established veg and fruiting plants, aim for a gentle all-purpose mix, around 1 to 20 to 1 to 30. In a 9-litre bucket, 1 to 20 is roughly about 450 millilitres of JLF, topped up with the rest, 8.5 litres of water. 1 to 30 is roughly about 300 millilitres of JLF, and then the rest up with water. You can then use that as a soil drench around the root zone, not straight onto tender leaves at full strength. And you do this every 1 to 2 weeks during active growing seasons. For seedlings and sensitive plants, go lighter, around 1 to 40 or 1 to 50. In a 9-litre bucket, 1 to 40 is about 225 millilitres of JLF, and 1 to 50 is around 180 millilitres of JLF topped up with water. For heavy feeders like tomatoes, capsicums and your cucumbers, your comfrey and grass brew is right in their wheelhouse. So you can afford to be a touch more generous, as long as your soil drains well and you're not stacking it on top of other high salt fertilizers. If you've got a meter, you can sanity check that the 9-litre bucket is landing around that 1 to 2 EC. If you don't, just stick with these ratios and watch the plants. They'll tell you pretty quickly if you've overdone it. Now, this is important. Always test new brews on a small patch first. Pick 2 or 3 plants you're happy to experiment on, run one stronger and run weaker, and see who's greener and happier after a week. If you're running high-tech beds with other inputs, use your JLF as a complement, not the main event. And keep an eye on the overall salt load if you are measuring with EC in the soil. That's the low-fuss, high-reward way to fold JLF into your existing system without chucking out everything that is already working for you. So what's the bottom line on this 90-litre comfrey JLF barrel? By using stuff I already had lying around, comfrey, lawn clippings, compost, leaf mould, and a bit of rainwater, I've ended up with a fertiliser that can hit similar nutrient levels to the fancy commercial liquids for basically zero ongoing cost. We've also ticked off a few big questions along the way. Well, what should the EC and pH be? The answer is there's no single magic number, but keeping your soil somewhere around an EC of 1 to 2 and not having crazy low pH in the bucket is a safe, practical target. Are EC and pH a measure of quality? No, not really. They tell you about strength and how harsh or gentle it might be, but the research on comfrey and nettle liquid show that they can match commercial fertilizers nutritionally when you use them at similar dilutions. And so when can you use it, and can it sit too long? Start from about the 2 to 3 week mark, especially in warm weather. Know that it just keeps on getting stronger the longer it sits, and treat those old, thick, dark brews as concentrates that need heavier dilution. On this comfrey barrel, that 2 to 3 week point already had me up around an EC of 9 in that stock solution, which is why a little bit in the bucket was all I needed. Now, that lemonade moment. I once let a JLF batch run way too long. Didn't bother measuring EC and got a bit cocky with the dilution, thinking, it's just plants, how strong can it really be? I hit a bed of perfectly healthy lettuce, and within a few days they looked like they'd copped a hot wind straight off the nullarbor. Instead of binning the whole idea, I just treated it as a concentrate. I backed off the dilution, something to around 1 to 50, and used it only as a soil drench. And the next round of plants absolutely loved it. And that's the lemonade spirit right there. Even the stuff-ups become part of the system as long as you're willing to measure, adjust, and have another crack at it. So now I'm curious, what's your wildest liquid fertilizer experiment been? Have you brewed something that absolutely smacked your plants in a good way? Or cooked them and taught you a hard lesson? Drop your story in the comments, because I reckon there's a whole lot we can learn from each other's dodgy barrels and surprise wins. And if you found this breakdown helpful, hit like and subscribe and share it with a mate who's got more weeds than a fertilizer budget.